Welcome back to the office. Today we are talking about I.A. Richards. So a lot of the book that you read is dedicated to Richards lamenting the fact that language is often A, misunderstood, and B, misused, and that in that it creates confusion. In other words, I.A. Richards is not interested in communication or rhetoric. He's interested in why we fail to communicate. So he's interested in miscommunication much more than communication itself. He talks about how this impacts persuasion in the book. So that's important. What they don't put in your book that I want to introduce you to is known as the semantic triangle of meaning. The semantic triangle of meaning is a three-part, there's a shocker, triangle that helps us understand why words, the relationship between words and an object or an emotion, abstract or concrete, why there's a disconnect. Okay, so I am sending to you in an announcement a link to something that I think you'll find very helpful, and that is in fact the triangle of meaning as it is labeled by I.A. Richards. When you look at that, which you might be able to pull it up while you're watching this as well or listening to this, he talks about three main portions of the triangle, the corners, and then he talks about their relationship along each of the sides. At the top, we have thought, or what's sometimes called the reference, okay? And the bottom, we have symbol on one side, which is like the word, the object, the word or the symbol. Those are really the only two words you should use for that. And then the third is the object or the referent, okay? And these three corners are linked together, two of them by solid lines and one of them by what it looks like a dotted or a dashed line. Why is that the case? Those are indicative of the relationships between, say, for example, symbol and reference. That has a solid line because when I choose a word, I know exactly what I'm referring to, okay? And I know how I feel about what I'm referring to. And on the other side, the symbol goes up to the thought or the reference, and so does the referent. In other words, from the referent to the thought, from the symbol to the thought, we have them meet together and they are solid. They're solid because most of that occurs inside our own brains. We know how we feel about that referent. We know how we feel towards that word. What is unclear is the relationship between the symbol and the referent. In other words, a word and its object. Now, let me give you an example. I can say to you that there is a cat, and you might think, okay, and you might have some general idea of what I mean, but what if I told you I'm thinking about a particular cat that is named, I don't know, Gummers. I'm just coming up with that one. Gummers, I could tell you, is an orange, black, and white cat. I can tell you that he's a kitten. I could tell you that he is extremely cute and fuzzy, and I love everything about him. I can also just say, there is Gummers, right? I could show you a picture. I could also, I can't right this second, but I could theoretically bring in a cat that looks exactly like that named Gummers, okay? So there are things that I can do to help you understand the reference I'm trying to make. And in other words, how I'm linking the word to its referent, okay? Now, what are we doing when I describe the thing I'm trying to talk to you about, the referent? When I keep describing that, what happens? I use more words. and we get into more and more triangles. The point is the relationship between a symbol or a word and the referent or the object is not stable. It is assigned randomly. There's no relationship between those two. If you remember reading John Locke, he talked about how there's no natural relationship between a word and its object, or a word and the thing to which it refers. That's exactly what I.A. Richards is building on here. Some people argue that I.A. Richards was the first postmodernist because he was the first one to question whether or not there could be a miscommunication based solely on language. And if so, does that mean that the truth is difficult to communicate? However, I don't think that he is a postmodernist. I think he is strictly a modernist. And the reason I say this is because he has this very clean, straight-lined model. It follows very clearly. It's not hard to understand. And he believed that this would explain everything to us. In addition, I think he's more like the modernist John Locke. He's exploring the relationship between a word and its referent. And again, let's go back to Gummers the kitty cat back here. Gummers there, I could show you pictures of. I could bring in a cat. I could do a lot of things to help demonstrate Gummers. Gummers is a concrete object. Gummers is something that can be seen. What ends up happening when we start getting into words such as love, peace, and so on, those abstract concepts or ideas are much more difficult to explain and to define. We can't demonstrate them. It's really hard to do. I could give you a piece of paper with the word love on it. It's a piece of paper with the word love on it. I am not giving you love, okay? So you probably understand all that, which is why Richard says that there is a solid relationship between the symbol and the thought, and that is absolutely correct because we use a symbol knowing exactly to what we refer. And between the referent and the thought, there is a solid line because pretty adequately we choose the words that best represent our reference. Okay? That's why he calls that adequate and calls the other side correct. Finally, on the bottom is what he calls the true relationship between the symbol and the referent. But as you see here, that dotted line, he says, stands for an imputed relationship, is what it should say. And that means that the relationship between the symbol and the referent are questionable. It might be true, but it's questionable. How do we communicate that to someone else? How can we make the symbol fully represent the referent? I hope all that makes sense to you. You could give yourself a headache by saying, I'm going to go down this rabbit hole of every referent I need to understand the triangle, the semantic triangle of meaning for. You'll go crazy trying to figure out sort of, I don't know if you've ever heard the old joke, but Bill Clinton once said in a court of law, that depends on what your definition of is. Just a ludicrous, reductive way to talk about meaning. And while I.A. Richards wasn't around for that, probably a good thing, it's something that's in my head a lot, what the meaning of is. I tell you guys sometimes when you're writing your papers, which you will be getting back, I still have not gotten those back, so please don't freak out just yet. And they're due, your second paper is due December 6th, so you should have plenty of time with my comments on your first paper to get to that second paper. But I will comment on your papers. I will say unclear referent. Okay, what do I mean by that? If, for example, you're writing your paper, and let's say that you're citing Aristotle, okay? So you say, in the rhetoric, Aristotle says blah, 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 and then you cite Aristotle, which is not hard to do, you just cite Aristotle. And then you put a period. And then you say, this is in contrast to Isocrates, who said blah, 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 blah. And then your third sentence starts, he. I don't know to whom you are referring. Is that he Aristotle, or he your comparison person of Isocrates? Who is the he? This happens a lot when people say, this happens a lot. That this that I'm referring to, that referent, you might be able to figure it out by context clues what that is referring to, right? But often in the written form, communication is not clear. So you say he, and I'm like, he who, right? Or you say, this means that, this means what, and that means what. So those are unclear reference, and it goes right back to this semantic triangle of meaning, because it's saying, I don't understand to what you're referring here. Now, so I still place I.A. Richards, who has very clear definitions for his model, and a very clear model for his thinking about miscommunication, particularly when it comes to word choice and language, which he says language poaches from other language, meaning it steals from other language. We put different things into different meaning. My best example of this is actually on TikTok. When somebody kept saying to me, that's very demure, right? And I'm like, okay. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's an odd word choice for this particular action we're talking about. And they're like, no, it's like from TikTok. Very demure, very, I forget what the other part was, calm or whatever it is that the word is. And I'm like, what? So I went on TikTok and I start looking for this, and I find all these videos with people like doing something going, and that was very demure, that was very whatever, using that voiceover. And I was talking to a couple of my students, and I was like, I'm just so glad you finally figured out what the definition of demure is, because I kept asking, what are they talking about? And they're like, oh, being very like sort of ladylike and very subtle and calm and all these other, and I was like, so you found the definition of demure, and this is a point of conversation. They were like, yeah. I'm like, okay, I can accept that. I mean, that's the other one that got me, was that we can talk about a lot of people having charisma. Charisma is a very sort of, it's a combination of a lot of qualities that makes somebody attract an audience, or helps audiences be persuaded by them, or they appear powerful in some way. Breaking that down to Riz, really, I was kind of like, is that necessary? Riz means what charisma means. Do we really have to just take it down to Riz? Like, is shortening the word that big of a deal? But in the end, the words mean the same thing. It's not changing the meaning, it's changing the symbol. And it's used as and we did this too, by the way. I am not criticizing one generation or another. We did this too. It's used to confuse people. For example, when I was a kid, which was in the 80s, we started saying things like, oh, dude, that's so bad. And people were like, what? And we're like, well, bad means good. In fact, in the original Ghostbusters, there's a reference to this where I think it was Venkman says, I'm sorry, I'm lost on this whole good bad thing. What's good? What's bad? We use that to confuse people. I don't think it was intentional. It was just something that started to happen, kind of like in the early 2000s when people started saying that's sick. I was like, wait, it's not sick. It's cool. That's awesome. They're like, yeah, it's sick. So they are sometimes generationally based because symbols evolve. But what you'll note is that the referent that those words are related to, those symbols are related to, the referent doesn't change, only the symbol. Now, when the referent does change, that's when things get even a little bit more confusing. So what do? We use more language to clarify our language. And that is going to lead us into the postmodern movement, which we're going to get into on Thursday. So I realized that the syllabus is a little bit confusing because it said that this lecture was on the 19th. I apologize for that. I clearly got the dates wrong. Okay, so don't worry though. We'll be fine. We'll catch up. It's all good. But for today, I know that you were supposed to read I.A. Richards. Hopefully this lecture helps you understand it a little bit more. He's not too long and he's not too difficult to understand. I think the biggest problem with some of the postmodern writers is that they just were flowery, right? I mean, all that poetry he throws in there. But generally speaking, relatively easy to understand, I hope. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or complaints, as always, let me know. In the meantime, keep reading. Watch for your papers with their hopefully extensive comments, or at least helpful comments, if not extensive. And I will see you all on Thursday.